dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. We're going to dive into what's happening in Charlottesville and the latest news. Chicago pastor asked Godfather to remove George Washington statue. Confederates taken down in Baltimore overnight. Alabama sues Birmingham over covering. Brooklyn Army base urged to rename streets honoring generals. Navy ship unlikely to change. Threats force Hollywood Cemetery to remove memorial. Nationalist groups plan rally in Lexington and Kentucky to oppose moving monuments. Feds refuse to remove memorials. And all the rest that's going on with this. This goes a lot deeper than the statues or the memorials. But at the same time, I also do think there is a importance, and this is something that even in the alternative sphere, the only people talking about this are those fringe elements, those very radical spectrums when it comes to political and social groups, nationalists being one of them, because they're usually national socialists. Definitely when you're talking about neo-Nazis and stuff. But there's something about the statues. And I don't want to get too caught up in this because then it'll be, he's defending Confederate statues. No, I'm defending all monuments, all historical significant, monuments. You don't see the, Jews out there going, we should have the Great Pyramids tore down because, that was built with slavery. That's how we view it, history, even though there's conflicting stories about that, as there is in the Civil War. But one of the main ways that a lot of these groups get power, whether it be from the alt-left or the alt-right, is you do remove monuments. When you look at every country that coups have been orchestrated, where rebel groups go in when you look at what ISIS does when they go into an area, part of removing anything that speaks of history is part of their narrative to rewrite history. It's not rewriting of history. The removing of Confederate statues is not rewriting history. That's where the alt-right, which I don't even consider them alt-right, that has been a name which I warned people when that alt-right came up. Do not associate yourself with the alt-right. Do not call yourself alt-right, because really the alt-right term originated from alternative media and the alternative right that originated under, Ron Paul. That's they're the alternative media, the people that would cover Ron Paul and actually show his numbers, actually show how good he's doing. Well, the mainstream media didn't do it. It was the alternative media, the alternative right media that was willing to show the truth about Ron Paul. But when this became a term that Clinton was using, a term that the left, the right, in almost an establishment way, but it wasn't the establishment. It was the alternative establishment that grabbed a hold of the term alt-right. And I warned people, do not associate yourself with alt-right, because this was becoming a movement that a group of people that, just as the communist socialists or the democratic socialists, as Bernie Sanders would say it, the alternative left have hijacked the Democratic Party. Clinton, that's why you lost, not because of Trump or Russia. Because the alternative left has been grabbing a hold of the Democratic Party. Well, the alternative right, even when Ron Paul was running, that's why back in 2007, a lot of us were going, they can support whoever they want, but if they're supporting Ron Paul, it's not for the same reasons we are. So we were calling out the neo-Nazis, the radicals that were trying to latch on to Ron Paul. They were called out, even though mainstream media at points did try to turn Ron Paul into the racist guy. And they even went to an article written by someone else that Ron Paul, he had his own little news thing, and someone wrote a racist article into that, and they try to pin that on Ron Paul. They tried to even kind of hint that he wrote it without saying it, because that would be a lie. So we'll just insinuate that he wrote it. That's what the alt-right is now. It's not the Ron Paul supporters. But in the process, again, the removal of the monuments is not erasing history. It's a preparation for the erasing of history. If you leave any monuments anywhere, they will be ones that will reflect what you want history to be known for. We know what we're taught in schools is not the truth about history. It wasn't when they were teaching whole different types of, Columbus is awesome. And now you can find school books where they talk about Columbus being, a murderer. So again, we're still not being told the truth about all of that. We're not told the truth anywhere. You have to find the truth yourself. And we have enough historical documents to know the history. When you look at Robert E. Lee, even though he was a flawed human being, he was a very inward looking person. He recognized his flaws. He worked to change himself. And I've heard people go, well, the South, if you think it was states' rights and not about, and this is coming from the right, if you think the Civil War was about state rights and not about slavery, you're wrong, because the Constitution of the Confederate States basically said you can't go against slavery. You have to be for it. That's true. That's part of the Confederate Constitution, and there were people against that part of it when it was being written. But if you look at Robert E. Lee, the inward-looking Robert E. Lee, and the things he talked about, the things he did, under the Constitution, you could get in a lot of trouble if you try to speak out against slavery. But with what respect Robert E. Lee held with the Army and his own inward looking, do you think that Jefferson Davis would have been able to stop Robert E. Lee from talking out against slavery? And that doesn't, forgive Robert E. Lee for any of his flaws, but it does say something about his character compared to others' character. And that not everything that we're taught is 100%, exactly how it was. So yes, the Confederate States under the Constitution were for slavery, and they were to, basically push for slavery through the expansion of the Confederate States. So if you think it is about states' rights, not for the Confederate government, not for Jefferson Davis. Now, if you want to talk about it, it was just about slavery, not for everybody that was fighting. For Robert E. Lee, it was about Virginia. My home is Virginia. I fight for Virginia. And the federal government should not be able to come in and tell Virginia what to do, that they have to be a part. That was Robert E. Lee. The Confederate States pushed slavery, stopped the feds from taking our slaves away. So there's conflicting things right there. And you have to be able to differentiate those two. But we have to call out both sides. And one thing Trump did is he called out both sides. That's good. But the way he did it was wrong. Very aggressive. You're making me, that type of attitude. Oh, you're making me call out the right, and you don't want me to call it. Well, that's how the media is playing it. And they're going to play on him snapping off about the left. And they're going to make it seem like, well, he thinks the left was much worse. They're both wrong. There was absolutely no good thing from either side. But does that say that everybody that showed up was wrong? No. The organization of it was wrong, but individuals might have went there for different reasons. The Heather that was unfortunately killed in the I forget get his name right offhand, but the gentleman that decided to drive his car through a crowd of people. I might disagree with what she believed, but I don't think she was there to, incite a riot, incite violence. She just happened to be there where the organized left was. She was just a convenient pawn to make the demonstration bigger. Same on the right. But look at the people leading both sides. Those are evil people. And I think with all of what's going on, I think we're hitting a turning point here in America. It's not looking good. And it's where you have the anti-fascists, which are national communists, socialists, and some are even global communists, versus the alt-right, which they are just, national socialists, national fascists. Some are even global fascists. But none of them actually belong in the group that they claim to be a part of, the alt-right. I'm sorry, if you want a bigger government, you're not on the right. If you want to shut down free speech, you're not on the left. And that's the thing. The left and the right have gone so far out of their what they claim to believe in that it allowed for that to happen. You blurred the lines. You say one thing, but once you're in power, you do the other. You only legitimize that. Now people are like, well, that the free speech thing, you can't have hate speech. What is hate speech? What is hate speech? Because honestly, when I watch mainstream media and them make broad statements that I know to be untrue to push an agenda that doesn't benefit me, puts me in a box, and makes these people ultra rich, ultra powerful, to me, that's hate speech. I'm going to jump into this Ron Paul Liberty Report covering hate speech. Is hate speech free speech? And even though I would look at them lying on mainstream media to push their agenda, a form of hate speech, I'm not going to go, no, mainstream media can't exist. I'm going to say, no, we need to come up with better TV programs, better news programs, better talk radio. Prove them wrong by doing better. And alternative media has been kicking mainstream media's butt. They just have money to keep going along. They still have corporate sponsors. that are pushing agendas for themselves, whether it be the pharmaceutical or the agricultural, the technology. They're getting funded. Alternative media, we rely on people to support, and we're still kicking their butt. But let's dive into this Ron Paul Liberty Report. Is hate speech free speech?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you.
How are you, Dr. Paul?
I am doing fine, and I'd like to talk about a very important issue. It's in the news, and we've heard about it for a long time, and it's fully discussed but poorly understood. And that has to do with hate crimes and hate speeches. And there's lots of excuses to punish people for hate speech. And I'd like to sort of get in a discussion on what hate speech really is, and does it deserve to be punished, and what is protected under the First Amendment. And quite frankly, I think they're too loosely defined, especially the hate speech and what should be done. But I happen to have this belief, which is a very libertarian constitutional belief, that speech should be protected. It's an individual right, and that we shouldn't use it as an excuse to punish people differently than anybody else. But we should have the right to free speech, and that means you can't slander and you can't libel people. So there are those kind of limits. But when they start talking about political correctness and speech that shouldn't be not permitted, and then turn these into crimes, you have to deal with the idea of subjectivity. Can you define it? And of course, a libertarian should be able to draw lines a little bit better than the Republicans and the Democrats, and draw the line that the crime occurs when violence is occurring. And sometimes there's fuzziness in there, and you have to work that out. But for the most part, it's pretty easy to define it when somebody throws the first stone or throws the first punch, and then it's offensive versus defensive. But it certainly has come up on this recent episode in Virginia, the demagoguing going on and the blame game going on, and Republicans understanding versus the Democrat understanding. But I think we have heard not a whole lot about the libertarian position on this issue.
Yeah, and as you pointed out too, and the right to free speech is not something granted by government; it's granted by the Creator. So the idea is that is a restriction of government restriction on speech. But the incident in Charlottesville, and especially the aftermath, has led a lot of people to call for more criminalization of so-called hate speech. But you point out it's very subjective. Nobody knows what it is, and there's a tendency, whoever says something I don't like, well, that must be hate speech.
Yes, and that's the main problem with it. It is subjective. A crime should be objectively defined. If you steal, rob, kill, injure people, yes, that's very, very objective. But motivation in this whole thing is, there was a time in our history, and some people seem to want to revive it. There was a time when certain groups were punished more than others. Obviously, during the early years of our country with slavery and blacks, they were punished more severely. But now the effort is to take groups, blacks and minorities and different groups, and say they should be, the perpetrator of a crime against them, they should be punished more severely. But from my viewpoint, they're actually using the same principle. If you can punish more so one group, and then all of a sudden, add on because of that, it's a sort of a reverse of what they've been doing. It doesn't solve the problem, because if you have one crime against a group and you say, well, it was motivated by hate and therefore we're going to punish you more. Well, what if the identical crime was committed against another group? Why should one group have a greater, punishment than the other group? So there's nothing fair about it. And I think it all comes because we have been conditioned, and it's getting worse. We see people in groups, and I think they do it on purpose. There's people in this country that want to see this come together. This whole political correctness issue, this cultural Marxism is stirring this up. And I think they don't want individual liberty, and they can stir up racial conflicts and political conflicts and then partisan conflicts. And then there's the charges made, and then you throw into the mix the media, and you end up a real mess because they drift away from some principles that aren't complicated. You have a right to your life. You have a right to say, well, you can say something controversial, and you can say things hateful, matter of fact. And you can, and you don't go to prison for that. It might be stupid, and you might be rejected socially, and people might not like what you're doing. But just to say something controversial, that was the whole purpose of the First Amendment, is to be able to say things controversial. Because if it's, well, we know what hate speech is, but that's different than about your government. Can you say anything you want about the government? What if I decided that the hate speech is against all those people who have perpetrated our wars in the last 15 years, where hundreds of thousands of people died, and there has been hundreds and thousands of people collateral damage, and they just brush it off. Why aren't those hate crimes? Well, I don't believe they're necessarily motivated by individual hate, and you punish the hate. That is a policy problem. It's an understanding. But I think that our problem is that not enough people really understand what free speech is like, and it can be controversial. Just go to the college campuses, and who knows what it is, because right now the universities, the university police, and the professors and the directors of the college, the board of directors, they permit the closing down of people who want to give a speech, and there's something not right about that.
Yeah, and the events of Charlottesville really are perfect for the enemies of free speech. Because if you take a position, and the ACLU has been very good on this, and they have a history of protecting, standing up for speech, even if it's very unpleasant. They've been under attack because people misrepresent what happened and say that the ACLU was defending Nazis, therefore the ACLU was pro-Nazi, and it's perfect for the people who don't like free speech. Because if you point this out, oh, well, then you agree with the Nazi protesters? Yeah. No, I think they're horrible. But they do have a right to say things that are very unpleasant.
One thing that happened, this we think is real reason, but it's been going on, for several decades, this whole thing about hate speech and all. But not too long ago, it has been converted into a federal crime. So even if you're dealing with a state issue, and if there's a crime committed, and it looks like, oh, this is a hate crime. He was motivated because he didn't like him because he was of a different color.
Yeah.
It becomes a federal matter. Just automatically, the federal government should come in if the states are abusing this. So it becomes a federal matter. And they also use the word perceived. If somebody is perceived to have hate, it can be used. Perception is very important. That's how arbitrary this is. But I still will emphasize the fact that if we saw rights as individuals and that we wouldn't see people as members of groups, that we would be a lot better off. There's no rights that come to us because we belong to a group. If one group is benefiting in contrast to another group, that's wrong, and you should stop that. But individuals should be treated the same, and I think all that's going on now is it's divisive, and it's political, and it's getting very serious, and the lines should be sharply drawn. Even this past weekend, I think it was pretty easy to say there was violence on both sides. But just think of the grief that Trump got.
Yeah.
Just say, well, and he said it in not a bombastic manner like he might do on some other issue. I thought he had a reasonable speech. Now I'll probably be ostracized. Now. But he said that both sides probably committed violence. What's so bad about that? I believe that to be the case. And where were the police? I mean, if anything, it needs investigated about why the police stood down. Who gave them the order to stand down? Yeah. And that is probably a true statement. I can't prove it, but it's certainly been reported by people who said that police were told to stand down.
Would people be shocked if they thought that someone was trying to get political advantage by doing something like that?
Oh, boy.
But how would a problem like this be solved? You've got one group put aside the reason for the protest was protesting against taking down the historical statues. But take a look at what actually happened. There's one group of people, a lot of them carrying Nazi flags, a lot of them doing things that are very unpleasant. And then you have this other group against them. How do you solve this problem of free speech? And a libertarian would talk about private property in society. But how would you solve it in the situation here?
Yeah, that's always messy when you have government property. How do you solve the problem of the proper books in public schools? Because that's propaganda so often. So it's a mess. In a public school issue, what you would hope for is local control of your schools, and your local school board and people could have a reflection on what that is like. But when it comes to something at a university, the university should be responsible. And they do. They have not anybody can close down a road and get out and demonstrate. You get a permit. It's pseudo private property. The school's supposed to run their school and have rules. So you get a rule. The group that comes to try to disrupt is bordering on committing a crime, because if they prevent you from doing this, let's say they just come in and actually they never even got to the point of having their speeches this past week. But let's say they're indoors or someplace and they're out there and they're having their speeches, and the speeches start and a couple people sneak in and they cut all the wires. So nobody can hear them. People could see that as a crime. But what if they have an organized effort to hoot and holler and blow whistles and drown them out? Yes, I think they've overstepped the line. They don't have to throw the stone. It's equivalent if they prevent it from happening by purposely disrupting and preventing people from saying it under this situation, then it's equivalent to coming in and cutting the wires to the microphone. Private property is an easy thing. Yeah. Remember Ronald Reagan when he had a little debate, I paid for this microphone? Private property is a solution to so much of this, because there's still, so far, even though there's been hints of it, that you can still go and say things in your churches and they don't invade. But there's been a few times where an incident was that people said, well, we want a copy of your sermon before you give it. And that's been there. So people would like to do that, and I said, well, what if you're preaching hate? Who knows what? They won't give you the benefit of the doubt, but on private property, you can say it. That means that, the media, we complain about the media, but we can't walk into the studios and say, I want equal time. Yeah. I have free speech. That doesn't work. So there are times when I think it's borderline. You have to think it through. But I tell you what, I bet you 99% of all this can be solved by individual liberty and trying to find who initiated the violence, who initiated the force. And of course, the libertarian principle is the non-aggression principle. Don't use aggression. But our big problem in society, and who teaches us and sets the standard, is the government. They're always using force. All these rules and regulations and affirmative actions and hate crime legislation, they're always trying to orchestrate, and pretend they know what motives are. And they don't take the line and divide the line and say, are you committing violence or not? And that to me is the real problem. And unfortunately, until people understand what the libertarian message is all about, this is going to get a lot worse, because the country's falling apart economically. Yeah. The foreign policy is in shambles. And this is part of my thesis that this is an end of an era. It's the end of the Keynesian era. It's going to be the end of our foreign policy era. So there's going to be more conflict, because some of this is orchestrated by the far left, the cultural Marxists, and that radicalizes other than they fight over the loot, because they know it's, if you look at the statistics to show what's in the pension funds and Social Security and medical care, how it's all failing. So that's why it's going to get much, much worse, believing that, they both believe in the use of force. Yeah. Conservatives use it just every bit as much in medical care and everything else. They use force. So it isn't a contest between those who like force and those of us who understand it to be property and voluntarism and no force and, property right. No, they're going to fight it out to control a dwindling pie, and that's why they're going to get very vicious, and that's where they are now. I mean, read for so many years, of the history of Europe mainly, where communists were fighting the fascists. And you see it in our mail, in our literature and the reviews. Every single day it's popping up. But I think it's done purposely to cause the conflict, cause the clash, and thinking that, the Marxists especially have done this for decades, of stirring up trouble, have chaos, and then people move in and have the solution. That's why you see people saying, yeah, this is disruptive. Maybe we need is socialism, and socialism has become, a word that people say, yeah, I guess so. I guess maybe we'll settle this as socialism. But we have too much government interference, whether it's communism, socialism, or fascism, or corporatism. It's all government force. And this is why you have these conflicts. And we have a job on our hands to try to get people to think more in tune with what we're talking about.
And, Lenin, he benefited so much from World War I. If there hadn't been a war, he probably would never have been able to get into power, but he benefited from that.
Right.
But the other thing is, each side, unfortunately, of the debate, as far as I see it, they take one side or the other. The left would go with the Antifa people. They're shutting down fascists. We got to support them. And a faction of the right would agree with the people who are fighting against taking down statues, what have you. And they're fighting. The more viciously they fight, it seems the more government wins. Because government will come in and say, we'll take more power than away. We got to stop this fighting.
I think that might fit into my argument. Yes, they both want power. Some want conservative power because they're the ones who, project their power and force and goodness around the world. And, of course, they participate in the welfare state as well, in the corporate state. And the other side wants a different system. But that's exactly what they're looking for, to stir up trouble and hope they can pick up the pieces. And where is the concern? In all this stuff we've heard the last month, 2, 3, or even in the last campaign, how often was it, what I want to do is emphasize the importance of personal liberty. And it's a moral issue. It's a God-given right for us to have our privacy, and that there is another way. But unfortunately, they don't talk about liberty. They talk about, forcefully redistributing wealth is what they're talking about, or benefiting one group versus the other. Where, if you had a libertarian society, you wouldn't have lobbyists. Sometimes people argue with me because I don't think you should regulate lobbyists, that they can't lobby because we're lobbyists. We're lobbying our government for a libertarian society. So you don't want to regulate speech.
Yeah.
So that I think is a lot different, to allow people to speak out and try to change the system. And that is indeed what we need.
Well, let's hope that the violence stops ratcheting up. But I do want to remind our viewers once again, get your tickets for our conference coming up next month, September 9th in Washington, D.C. I've got an announcement, Dr. Paul, if you don't mind. Jacob Hornberger is going to join us. Future Freedom Foundation, great friend of yours, great friend of ours for a long time. Probably one of the best speakers out there. Very motivating. He was there last year, and he brought down the house really with a great speech. He's just agreed to join us. So Jacob Hornberger is going to be there. Get your tickets right away. We look forward to seeing everyone.
Very good. We have some seats left, but we are at a point where there's not an unlimited number of seats. So please call in and get your ticket if you're inclined to come. And I do want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I know this subject is not an easy subject for a lot of people because I don't think you hear what, a libertarian principle would be from the television. You're hearing two sides of authoritarians. There, many are authoritarian. But like I said in our little talk here today, I did not think that Trump was way off base and the criticism he got was way out of proportion because he did lean in the direction of a libertarian answer because he says, why don't we look at this as who created the violence? And that is the right thing to do. All the violence didn't come from one side. And the other thing that we have to remember is let's say, for instance, that from the cultural Marxists, let's say they do 10 times more violent acts than the other side. Would they get 10 times more criticism in the media? No way. I mean, The media is definitely biased. But I still want to remind people that even the option, generally speaking, toward the left who offers government solutions are not getting the libertarian answer to it. They're generally getting a conservative approach to the use of government to try to mold people's personal lives and mold the economy and manage the world empire. So we have a lot of work cut out for us. But in spite of it all, I still think a lot of people are listening to what a libertarian message is all about. And even though this may be a difficult subject, I think it does give us an opportunity to introduce ideas to people, realizing that liberty is individual and that we should not think of people as just belonging to a group. They neither should be punished nor rewarded because they belong to a group. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, RonPaulLibertyReport.com, and Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube. Check them out. Subscribe. So is hate speech free speech? Hate speech is free speech until it becomes something that becomes physical. Now, the left wants to continue to talk about the hate coming out of the right, alt-right, should I say, which is not anything to do with the right. Let me make that clear. If you consider me right, which I don't even consider me right, but some do, I consider myself more of a centrist because I'm a libertarian worried about my individual freedom and supporting everybody else's individual freedom in the process because, well, you kind of have to do that if you want individual freedom. So I don't even consider myself right, but others do because, oh, well, libertarians towards the right, whatever. I don't consider the alt-right right at all. I don't consider the alt-left left at all. I think if you put the right, the left, the alt-right, the alt-left all on a spectrum, and let's say we'll put freedom, 100% freedom, individual freedom at 0 on this scale. Constitution might fall somewhere in between, 3 or 4. The establishment left and the right, they're probably up there around maybe a 6 or a 7. And on the full authoritarian side is where you have communism, fascism, socialism, oligarchies, royalty, emperors. Those are all on the authoritarian side. The left and the right have more in common with each other than they do with the alt-left and the alt-right. But guess what? Again, the alt-left and the alt-right are starting to take over the right and the left. They're becoming that establishment. I hope not. I hope we're not seeing that turn in America today. But it seems like that's what's happening with all this. So, again, hate speech is free speech. And the thing about it is the Antifa people, the people that are trying to justify their violence because of hate speech also have committed hate speech in their own definition, because they claim even if anybody says something that's not politically correct, but it's 100% factual, that's hate speech against gender or a transgender or a non-gender, whatever you want to call it. If you say something that's factual, it's hate speech if it doesn't praise that side. But at the same time, they will go around and call people that don't agree with the left fascists. They will call libertarians that don't agree with the left fascists. So they commit their own form of hate speech. But let's say they didn't. Does the other side having, that freedom to express hate justify violence? And I've had this argument, if someone smarts off enough to you, you're going to end up hitting them. Well, not really. I kind of usually laugh at them. Because for me, until you do something to me, I don't consider that a problem for me. You can talk all the crap you want about me, and to me, oh well. Not only that, by the media not addressing the Antifas and their violence and their hate speech, they are validating the left. By those small-minded puppets in the Antifa committing violence against people that weren't being violent, just expressing free speech, which happened to be hate speech, but it's still free speech. By attacking them physically, violently, you validated them. So the idiot puppets that want to go fight the idiot racists and the idiot neo-Nazis, validating why they're marching in the first place. And then the media validating the left by not condemning them or not even wanting to address them even, being there damn near. Peaceful protesters against the racists. Did you see the same videos I seen coming out? I seen violent leftists against idiot, racist, alt-rightists. I didn't see any good side there. Again, yeah, there were individuals there that might have been there for a good reason. But guess what? You were there with a group of people there for the wrong reason. And they will not call them out. They are validating the violence from the left, which in turn validates the complaints and the hate speech from the alt-right. They were made for each other. And they probably were. And by saying that, I'm saying that there's forces behind this. Before we get into more of that, I do want to play a short clip here from We Are Change, what you need to know about Charlottesville from an unbiased perspective. So let's get into this.
This is Zukradowski of WeAreChange.org, and of course, everyone today is talking about the latest events that just unfolded in Charlottesville, Virginia. Today, we have a very special guest who is there on the ground and will actually give us a perspective that's not biased either on the left or on the right. And on today's broadcast, we had Ford Fisher, editor-in-chief of News to Share. His link will be in the description below. He was there on the ground today. And Ford, first of all, I have to ask you, how are you and what happened today from your perspective? There's a lot to take in here, but coming from an independent perspective, how did you see everything unfold today?
So first of all, physically, I'm fine. I had a few pepper spray burns, actually from both sides. So you're talking about independent not being left or right. I got attacked by both of them, or at least in the crosshairs of the crossfire of both of them, so to speak. The main thing, the sort of most breaking news out of today was that there was a car crash incident that was seemingly intentional, in which about 19 people were hit by a pileup of 3 different cars, one of which hit the first one intentionally. And so one person, basically I witnessed having CPR administered on her for several minutes, and it appeared that they had given up. And I reported at the time on my live stream that it appeared that she had died. And in fact, the governor confirmed that an hour later.
We're also getting news right now that a police helicopter crashed and 2 police officers who were monitoring the whole rally also passed away. So the ramifications from this are not just going to be from the, very little. They're going to be very big, and they're going to be playing out later on. I'm sorry, continue, Ford.
So we went to the crash site, although police were stopping people from getting anywhere close enough to it to do any meaningful reporting on it. But I would note that it hasn't been confirmed that it was a police helicopter. We think it was a helicopter that was watching the people, and we think it was a police helicopter, but that actually has not been confirmed. So it is within the realm of possibility that it could have been a photographer or something associated with one of the 2 groups, or even with the media. But we just don't know yet. As to earlier in the day, basically there was all of the Unite the Right type people in the area that they were sort of designated to be in. And police mostly had a hands-off approach. They had set up barricades between that and then the outside protesters who were basically supposed to stay outside of the park. The problem is that, of course, the right-wingers have to walk through those protesters in order to get into the park. And so most of the violence occurred kind of at that peripheral. And that was where the militia was taking, and by that I'm talking about the Oath Keepers and the 3% type people, were trying to take a role of separating the 2 groups. Antifa tended to condemn them by saying, well, you're essentially defending the right-wingers, right? Whereas the militia people said, we're truly neutral. We're not attempting to help anybody. We're literally just trying to stop the violence. Part of the reason I wanted to come to this whole thing was because of that aspect. Many of these guys are veterans, and they look at a political gathering and a political gathering's counter-protest, and they're treating it like a war, and it turned out to turn into that. So I think there's a real question to be asked about how we got to this point.
Yes, there's a lot of divide and conquer. There's a lot of polarization. And a lot of people are saying that this is only the beginning of it. I mean, I've been seeing the inclinations of this from the very beginning. But from your perspective, it would be very interesting to get a critique and kind of a report on how the police acted, because we've seen from other events, like in Berkeley, where there was police and they left the scene and let these 2 sides fight each other, sort of like not helping in any way. We saw that repeatedly happen in other protests around the country. What did you see on the ground, and how do you think the police conducted themselves today?
Right. So mostly the police stayed uninvolved for the first couple of hours. Eventually, the barricades that they had originally set up were taken down by the Antifa. So once there was almost no physical barrier between the Antifa and the Lee Park, the police declared it to be an illegal gathering. And by the way, this was before noon. The rally was supposed to start at noon. So before the rally even started, police declared it an illegal gathering. And all kinds of violence happened before then, and police stayed completely out of it. It was once they declared this rally is canceled that riot cops slowly, by attrition, took out the entire park. And it was at that point that I realized that was probably a mistake tactically. And the reason for that is that they ended up permeating out into the world of the sort of leftist protesters, all of these right-wing type people who now had absolutely no barrier between them and the other guys. And that caused, for miles in every direction, this fight to have expanded and become much more chaotic and confusing Whereas at least there were kind of a clear sense of this is the left-wing guy, this is the right-wing guy, right? People kind of knew what was going on. It turned into chaos once they tried to shut down the rally.
Yeah, it really doesn't make sense from a policing standpoint. I mean, I seen something very similar happen in San Diego at a Trump rally where the police decided to make one line after there was clashes. There was a clear divide. And instead of dividing the two sides from fighting each other, the police came from the other side and squished everyone together, causing everyone to even fight more against each other with just outrageous clashes. Do you think this could have been prevented today with the way that the police acted?
Yeah, so frankly, I think that if the police had taken an approach more similar to the militia, they might have stopped the violence. If they had allowed the rally to continue and basically stopped people from permeating across the two sides, basically just keep the sides separate, let them scream at each other from across layers of cops and whatever, then they could have had at least those 5 hours of the rally without a whole lot of back and forth. By the police just shutting down the rally and pushing everyone into one place, they ended up creating a situation where I posted a photo earlier on my Facebook of there was a guy who pulled his handgun out of his holster and pointed it at them.
Wow.
And granted, a lot of people were open carrying, and but having your rifle just kind of slacked over your shoulder, it's not a huge deal. But actually unholstering the handgun and pointing it above lower ready is a really provocative, right? Arguably kind of menacing act.
Yeah.
And so that sort of thing started happening once these guys started getting pushed together. And in a way, the police were, I don't want to use the word cowardly, but they would have been putting themselves on the line a little bit to get in the middle. But I think that they would have saved a lot of people from getting hurt.
Yeah. Now, online, there's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of blaming. There's a lot of people saying that it was people are part of the alt-right, the Unite the Right rally that were instigating the violence. Some people are saying, no, it's all because of Antifa. From being there on the ground, who was more aggressive? Who was instigating a lot of the conflict there? Was it both sides, like I personally am seeing online?
Yeah, so it tends to, I think this was probably consistent with other ones that I've seen, where generally speaking, the left wing tends to initiate the violence. The difference with this one is that the right wingers were way more prepared for it in terms of weapons and shields and things like that. So yeah, left wingers tend and shields and things like that. So yeah, left wingers tended to be attacking. For example, the moment that I got pepper sprayed was Richard Spencer was trying to walk up to the park. He had about 8 security guys around him. There were also some Identity Europa people around him. And an Antifa just came up and tried to pepper spray the whole group, right? And so they ended up spraying me, other press, a couple of those Identity Europa guys, and I don't even think they got Spencer. But so there were a lot of things like that. But Spencer is not really a fighter. The group that was really, really, really violent, even if they didn't start it, they sure as hell tried to finish it, was the Traditionalist Workers' Party. And to people who don't know, that's a party with a National Socialist philosophy. So literally just straight up neo-Nazis under a different name. Those guys came with shields and helmets. And when Antifa went to confront them, they had pepper spray that they sprayed from behind their shields, and they were hitting people with flagstaffs. They were clearly prepared to beat the crap out of the people who opposed them, and that's exactly what they did.
Wow. Now, I'll be honest, from a political, perspective, that this is kind of a sad day in American politics, with the discourse going this low, to have these kind of events unfold, especially with people dying, and especially seeing the trajectory of this even going further. But from my own personal perspective, understanding that billionaires like the Koch brothers financed the right, and then other billionaires like Soros financed the left. To me, it's not really left and right. It's really more about the billionaires, more about up and down that people should be concerned about. That's how I see it. From your understanding, from everything you went through, how do you see it, and how has being a part of today's event impacted you with your understanding of the kind of political discourse that we have in this country now?
So it's interesting because last night I saw a little bit of political discourse. I was at the UVA thing where about 250 of these alt-right guys did a rally where they held tiki torches and, it looked like a KKK styled event, and they marched through campus, and there ended up being one brawl and one arrest. They were chanting actual kind of political stuff, so to speak, and it was really, really extreme right wing, kind of what you'd expect. And then there were left wingers there who chanted the counter chants like no Trump, no KKK, no racist USA kind of stuff. So at least there was a little bit of politics there. Today was honestly just fighting. There was the speeches that the Unite the Right had planned didn't end up happening. Antifa to some degree was doing chants of Black Lives Matter, but hardly. There's pretty much no debating. If there was a confrontation, it was just kind of screaming at each other and fighting. At the end of the day, if you looked at any two people in a fight and you swapped their positions, right, it wouldn't make much of a difference. It kind of just became this homogenous, like left versus right, red versus blue, team one versus team two kind of thinking. It was kind of just pure factionalism.
Yeah, Ford Fisher of News to Share, his link will be in the description below. I want to thank you for your incredible work on the ground. All of your work will be linked so people could go check it out and subscribe to you. I will join you in the field at the next one. I promise you that. But I want to also leave you with the last word and anything else you want to say about just today and what you experienced.
So I think that what people have to look at today is how did we get to this point, right? These things aren't isolated incidents. And while the individuals who do the violence are responsible for themselves, right, I don't generally believe in kind of collective identity punishment, so to speak. Right, there are lunatics in any group, but I think it's worth thinking about how we got to a point in political discourse where people feel like fighting each other on the streets is going to have some kind of a real world outcome. So the Antifa, are you really going to beat the crap or literally beat the racism out of somebody's head? I kind of doubt it. And on the right, are you really going to defeat leftist government by beating up some random leftist on the street? Also, probably not. And that's not to say that they're going to be able to achieve what they want through books and debates and things like that. But they're going to do a lot less damage if they pursue peaceful means to their own agendas.
Exactly. Very well said, especially with agitation, especially with trying to trigger somebody, especially with trying to be right all the time and upholding one side and not trying to see both sides of the story. Ford, I thank you for your great independent work, and I want to thank everyone for watching and subscribing. We're going to have more news coming here your way on youtube.com/We Are Change.
WeAreChange.org and We Are Change on YouTube. Check them out. Subscribe. Great things coming out of We Are Change and Luke Radowski. That was a great interview, and it really kind of proved the point I was making. And when you look at it, and you got to realize we've had the radical left for a long time. We've had the radical right, and again, they're really not left or right. They are up and down. But calling them what the mainstream media wants to call them, alt right and alt left. When you look at it, these groups have been around, and they've held these events. These KKK groups, these neo-Nazis, they've gotten permits before. They've held things like this before. What's the difference? One, neither side was going to be violent. The police held the neutral ground. They allowed both sides to yell at each other. No racist USA, and then, whatever the white supremacists are yelling KKK and neo-Nazis. And neo-Nazis doesn't necessarily mean racist, but they are kind of more with the eugenics. Now, you look at things that the Nazis proclaimed. These are the same things that the left, the Democrats, push for. Some of the same things you see out of the KKK. Well, the KKK primary supporter, Democrats. Only in recent time have they occasionally came over to the Republican side. Why? Well, because the Democrats, they went from just being racist and undercover against, white people that they considered dumb in their eugenics movement, but really focused on, blacks during the eugenics movement. They evolved. Now they want to pretend they're everybody's friend while pushing policies that make the very few elite more powerful, and they stick to that eugenics and just consider the rest of us undesirables. If we're not at their level, if we're not rich and powerful, then we're undesirable. So it doesn't go along with what the KKK wants. What the Republicans tend to push isn't exactly what the KKK wants. But what they see is a friend in the liberty arena. And I hate that because I profess freedom and liberty. But that doesn't mean I support everybody's speech just because I support freedom of speech. But that's what's attracted them. Why? Because government has gone above and beyond. Where if they perceive your speech as hate, they can make it a federal offense. Well, hate speech has always been protected speech, and it's something that racists, eugenicists, all of them proclaim. So they want the ability to proclaim that. Hence why they went more with the not libertarians, but liberty people within the Republican Party. Why they wanted to back Ron Paul. Doesn't mean because they back someone that someone. I don't think Trump's a racist. His flaw was not being vocal enough at the very beginning when these groups started coming out talking about what great things he's going to do. Now with the media, what it gets me, they won't call out the Antifa because they push the agenda that they want. But if they really were against neo-Nazis, what really gets me is they go out and tweet something that goes along with what the Nazis were doing. Getting rid of the undesirables. Why? Because, the left was involved in eugenics. They don't want to equate the two, that eugenics was not a Nazi thing. It actually started with the left in America, something that Hitler adopted and people around Hitler adopted and took to the next level. They weren't putting out pretty, by the end of it, they weren't doing commercials about how someone's undesirable or, does their life really count? Well, now you got, I think it was CBS that was posted or tweeted about how great Iceland's doing with getting rid of Down syndrome through abortion. That's eugenics. That's also what the Nazis would have loved to have seen. Don't allow undesirables to be born. And then, if what they're doing over there is like doing like some type of test, blood test or whatever, to see if your kid might be born with Down syndrome, basically pushing for abortion. Well, what happens when that test goes, well, enough of you didn't go ahead with the abortion, so now if you test positive in this test that you might have a Down syndrome kid, we might just go full eugenics and fix you so you won't have any kids. We wouldn't want any undesirables running around. That's full out eugenics. Something that the Nazis perfected, but something that came out of the left here in America. That's where the Nazis got it from. And they want to denounce the neo-Nazis? Well, good, but you have to denounce things in your own history and things that you're proclaiming now. Otherwise, you're denouncing the potato for the potato. That's not a real good argument. That's why the mainstream media is failing. That's why this leftist media is failing. Because you're telling us the potato is not good, but try the potato. Selling the exact same fruit from the exact same tree and changing the name. They are no better. I don't know how they get up in the morning and get on air and proclaim this stuff and denounce the same crap while proclaiming the same crap. Why they sit up in their bubble and part of it's, they see what the people that are paying them want them to see. They're putting them in the positions and the places that make them feel good. As long as we keep pushing our agenda, this is how life will be for everyone. Bullshit. And I would be attacking the KKK or the neo-Nazis more right now. But guess what? They've been around. They've held these rallies. They haven't had the media, backing them. The left extremists have the media, the majority, other than, a Fox News. When you look at the mainstream media, almost all of them are covering for the violence from the left because it's their side. They claim to be against fascism. They are fascists and communists and anarchists. not the libertarian anarchists, the tear the system down and destroy everything anarchists, the stereotypical one. Burn it all to the ground. And we do need to denounce that alt-right that's more, up or down, whichever one you want to cover, that one under. But we have denounced them. By them being able to have rallies, knowing people just go, "What? Look at these idiots over there." We've made them smaller. We've taken their power away throughout the years. Now you have the crazy leftists only validating and making them bigger. You've had this political correctness, definitely with this white privilege crap. I know people that have kids. They're not, well off people. They're getting by, but very, very barely getting by. Their kids have new shoes for school, but they're not a nice, expensive pair, and they're white. And one was telling me, he wanted a different pair of shoes because he went to school, and he goes to school in a majority black area, which nothing wrong with that. But he was talking about, he wanted Jordans. And I was listening to him talk about it, and I'm like, okay, whatever. But then I was also later on reading about, white privilege and some of the stuff they were, teaching in some of these classrooms. So you start teaching this white privilege to real young kids. So let's say you got a black kid in the class, and his parents do well, and they're able to, buy him the nicer shoes and nicer clothes. Nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Should be able to if you can afford it. It's your money. Do what you want. Nothing wrong with that. Then you got the white kid. He doesn't have name brand stuff on, but it's good stuff. It's new. His parents are taking care of him. Make sure he has decent clothes and decent food in his stomach. But he's at school. He sees a black kid with the new kicks and all name brand clothing, Jordans, and he can only have the knockoff New Balances. The Walmart brand New Balances. Can't afford no Jordans. And then at the same time, the school's telling him that he should, step aside and, you have white privilege. So now this kid's looking, going, I'm privileged because I'm white. I don't feel privileged. I live in a trailer. I have New Balances that came from Walmart. Whether the black kid sitting right here, he's got Jordans and his parents can afford a house. I don't think I'm privileged. What's wrong with me? That's going to be one confused kid. Do you think that confused kid that's being told all this is going to go, oh yeah, I want to go with Black Lives Matter? Or would he be easily influenced by propaganda from a white supremacist group? They're beating you up. They're beating you up. Both sides are fucking guilty for this shit. And it really just pisses me off. But the left, with their media cover-up of any wrongdoing of the left, is just, it's astronomical. I do want to play this. Dinesh D'Souza and Stefan Molyneux talking about the fascism from the left, what they claim to be against, but then they propagate it too. I'm not going to play this whole thing because I don't want to run out of time at the end of the show, so I'm going to stop it partway through, but we'll go ahead and get into it now, and then we'll talk about it here.
Radio. We are back with Dinesh D'Souza. He is the author of the #1 New York Times bestsellers, Hillary's America and America Imagine a World Without Her. His other best-selling books include Obama's America, The Roots of Obama's Rage, What's So Great About America, What's So Great About Christianity, Life After Death, A Liberal Education, and now, which we're going to be talking about today, in a way, before we scheduled this interview, there was no such thing as Charlottesville and so on, so we're going to tie that into contemporary events. The book is The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left. You can find, of course, his book at bigliebook.com. Website is DineshD'Souza.com, twitter.com/Dinesh D'Souza, and we'll put the links to those in the show notes. Dinesh, thank you so much for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Good to be on the show.
So it's a challenging paradigm, and I remember this when I was a kid first starting to learn about politics. What a brain-bending Mobius strip it seemed to be when they said, well, you see on the far left, you have communism, and on the far right, you have Nazism or fascism, whereas it seems to me these things kind of curved around and met in the rear of sort of collectivism, tyranny, big government interference in the free market, and so on. So I wonder if you could help people shatter some of that paradigm, because I think it's that kind of thinking that has seesawed us into this ever-escalating state power situation.
Well, the notion that communism is on the left and fascism on the right was given a certain kind of visual corroboration when in World War II you had the Soviet Union, the communists on one side, you had the fascists, Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy on the other side. So this kind of convinced people looking at it that they must be ideological opposites. Now, historically, we know that ideologies that are actually very similar, that differ sometimes on very fine points of doctrine, nevertheless go to war. And they go to war not just over fine points of doctrine, but they go to war over competition for power, for followers, for territory, and so on. Think of the Shia and the Sunni. They're both inside the House of Islam. They've been fighting for centuries. So communism and fascism are both forms of collectivism. They actually differ on a fairly minor point. Communism is always purported to be international. Fascism is essentially National Socialism. That was actually the name of Hitler's party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So yes, if you drew a spectrum, I would put on the left side of it communism, fascism, progressivism, socialism. On the right side of the spectrum, I would put people who believe in individual rights, limited government. So if you think of a, quote, right-wing extremist, that would be someone who is so extreme in their commitment to individual liberty that they want the government to be so small as to be virtually non-existent. I envision a guy running up and down the street uprooting stop signs. He doesn't want the government to do even that. That's a real right-wing extremist.
Right. Now, let's talk about some of the roots of fascism. And I want to talk about this before we get into the definition, because I think understanding that fascism was a root of Marxism. And as you point out in the book, Mussolini, in watching Italy's invasion to get some resources from Libya, recognized that the people in Italy responded much more to nationalistic fervor than they did to sort of this internationalist class fervor. And that's one of the reasons why, and Stalin did this later on, of course, he began to root his collectivism more in the nation state rather than in the class. But I wonder if you can help people understand just how deep the roots into Marxism, the supposed fascist movement, goes.
Well, the reason this is very important, because this is a part of the origin of fascism that the left has suppressed. The progressives in academia I've tried to make sure that this story does not get into the textbooks, because fascism is an outgrowth of Marxism and of socialism. At the end of the 19th century, a lot of intelligent Marxists were scratching their head because the prophecies of Marx weren't coming true. Marx had predicted the outbreak of communist revolutions in countries like England and Germany, and this just wasn't happening. So the smart Marxists said, something is wrong with Marx. We need to modify Marx. We need a kind of new Marxism, if you will, for the 20th century. And out of that came two offshoots: Leninist Bolshevism, itself a revision of Marxism, and Mussolini's fascism. Mussolini was, in fact, a Marxist, the most famous Marxist in Italy, along with Gramsci. And Mussolini was the editor of the Socialist Party magazine. So that when Mussolini became a fascist, it was seen as a leftist move. Shortly after Mussolini's march on Rome, establishing the first fascist regime in the world, Lenin sent a telegram of congratulations. Why? He recognized Mussolini as a fellow revolutionary of the left.
Well, and the relationships between all of the tyrants, it's to me sort of like the relationships between mafia bosses or sort of criminal syndicate bosses. Sometimes they'll be in alliance, sometimes they'll be viciously opposed, but they fundamentally share the same worldview and also share the common enemy, which is the police. And I wonder if you can help people understand the sort of interweaving of positive feelings and relationships between people like FDR and Mussolini and Hitler and so on, because that is one of the great blows to the historical narrative that shows up in your book.
Yes, most of this historical narrative, it should be emphasized, is not known in America, even by educated people. Why? Because the progressives coming to power in academia and the media after the war, this is after World War II, once fascism had been permanently discredited with the reputation of Holocaust, these progressives go, all this history that we know, we don't want young people to know. If they did, progressivism would suffer a blow from which it would never recover. So we've got to make sure that this stuff is left out of the textbooks. Now, what we're talking about here is the deep and intimate connections between the Democratic Party and the progressive left on the one hand, and fascist Italy and early Nazi Germany on the other. These connections, before I started this book, I thought that they were mainly in the form of analogies. So, for example, in America, we had the Ku Klux Klan, 3 to 5 million members in the 20s. The Nazi brown shirts over in Germany, they have 3 to 5 million members. Both are paramilitary organizations. Both are majorly into costumes. Both practice racial terrorism. Both have a kind of vulnerable minority to pick on. Blacks in the case of the Klan, Jews in the case of the Nazis. Both are the extension of an actual political party. The brown shirts are an extension of the Nazi party. The Klan is the extension of the Democratic Party. So I saw these analogies, but what I didn't realize is that there were actually more intimate connections. The Nazis are actually drawing on the American Democratic Party and American progressives to implement some of their most destructive and genocidal schemes.
Oh, let's talk about that, because that's a fascinating part in the book. How the Nazis, when looking to draw up their racial purification laws, looked at the Democrats in the United States, but they said, well, they go too far. Let's pull it back. I mean, this is something that, again, would blow the narrative right out of the water were it more widely known, which, of course, is why you wrote the book and why we're having this conversation.
Well, I have to credit the Yale historian James Whitman for discovering this, but Whitman is himself a leftist, and he tries to cover up the significance of his own findings by not blaming the Democrats, but just by blaming America. America is to blame. Now, here's what he's talking about. He's talking about 1935 when the Nazis, the senior Nazi officials, the head of the Justice Department and so on, who are drafting up the Nuremberg laws, which would turn Jews into second-class citizens. These are laws that would segregate Jews into ghettos, forbid intermarriage between Jews and other Germans, confiscate later the property of Jews. So these Nuremberg laws, it turns out, were directly based on the blueprint of the Democratic Party laws in the Jim Crow South. It should be remembered that every segregation law in the South was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials. This is why Whitman ultimately is part of the big lie. He's trying to put the blame generically on America when it falls squarely on the Democratic Party. But yes, the Nazis basically take the Democratic laws, They cross out the word black, they write in the word Jew, and they're almost home free. But then, what you alluded to, one of the Nazis raises a very interesting question. Who is a Jew? He points out that there's been intermarriage over the centuries between Jews and other Christians. So how do you decide if somebody who's a quarter or half or three-quarter Jewish, do they qualify and count as Jews? So the Nazis then once again turn and say, well, how do the Democrats solve that problem in America? And they discover that in America, the Democrats have the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule is basically if you have any discernible trace of black ancestry, even one drop theoretically, you're black. And the Nazis look at each other and they decide, they go, that's too much. In other words, you're the Nazis saying the Democrats are too racist even for us. We can't say that if you have one drop of Jewish blood, you're Jewish. So in the end, the Nuremberg laws required, in order to be Jewish, you have to have 3 Jewish grandparents, and then some other considerations are added about how orthodox you are in practicing and so on. But bottom line of it is the Nazis took a softer line on the question of defining racial identity than the even more racist Democrats.
Yeah, I think that's quite fascinating as well. And there also is a very strong attempt to, of course, separate these two ideologies and place them in opposition as a way of, I guess, obscuring their common roots. And we can see, of course, this going through Wilson, and as you point out, FDR and some of the other American presidents on the left or from the Democrats, and how much they seem to follow the fascist model of controlling business while still allowing for nominal private ownership.
Yeah, some of the people, watching this program might say, well, Dinesh, this is very damning information indeed, but we're arguing about history, and I think for young people, ancient history. What does this matter today? And I would say, listen, first of all, the ideology of the Democratic Party now, its economic ideology, is essentially indistinguishable from fascism. It's actually closer to fascism than it is to, say, Marxian socialism. Consider this. Socialist countries like to nationalize private industry. In my native country of India, the socialist governments since the 1940s would take over the banks. They would try to take over the energy sector. They'd try to own the airlines and so on. Now, in America, we don't have that. Even under Obama, look at Obamacare. We have private hospitals. We have private health insurance companies, but the government tells them what to do. The government sets the prices. The government decides who's eligible. So we have state-directed capitalism. We've seen that in the banking sector, in investment houses. We've seen it in the energy sector. So this state-directed capitalism much more closely approximates classical fascism than it does classical socialism.
Well, and one of the things it does is it provides a wonderful scapegoat. One of the problems with communism, among its many moral problems, is the problem that if the state owns the means of productions, then of course the state is terrible at producing things. And the state then gets blamed. But if you have this sort of category of people who nominally own the businesses, when the businesses fail to produce, the government can say, well, it's these terrible businessmen, they're to blame and so on. So it actually creates a scapegoat for the inefficiencies of state control that serves the powers that be quite a bit.
That and to look at it another way, Mussolini recognized that the state doesn't know how to do these things. So essentially he said, listen, we'll let the private sector make stuff. But then we've got to make sure that private industry, just like private individuals, that their lives are at the service of the state. I mean, Mussolini is a very interesting figure because he's the founder of modern fascism, much more so than Hitler. Hitler rarely called himself a fascist. You can read Mein Kampf and the word fascist almost never appears. Mussolini established the first fascist regime in the world more than a decade before Hitler came to power. So Mussolini says fascism is everything is in the state and nothing is outside the state. You can almost look at the state as a kind of living organism, a living creature, and each individual is a cell within the organism. So our lives and our rights don't matter except to the degree that we serve the state. Well, hey, does that sound like the platform of the Republican Party or the platform of the Democratic Party?
Quite right, quite right. Now, let's talk about Wilson, because this is something that you go into in the book. He's considered to be quite a hero by people who love to read speeches rather than look at what actually happened. National self-determination and global democracy, this is what he talked about. And then they imposed this brutal peace on Germany after the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, which, I think it's a very strong case to be made, led directly to World War II. But what people don't understand is how he revived the KKK, and he also segregated since the end of the Civil War, the federal government had been desegregated. He resegregated it, and people have a tough time. Well, there was this odd quirk in his personality that it just happened to be a seemingly virulent racist, but it's all over whatever he does. And again, it's scrubbed from history.
I love the way that these progressive historians treat this material. They'll say, they're scratching their heads over why Wilson would screen a pro-Ku Klux Klan movie in the White House. The historian Ira Katz-Nelson of Columbia writes a whole book called Fear Itself. He goes, it's extremely puzzling that FDR cut a deal with the Democratic racists to block anti-lynching legislation and exclude blacks from New Deal programs. Recently it's come out that young JFK went to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, comes back effusive with praise of Hitler. Even as late as 1945, JFK is calling Hitler, quote, a legend. Now, again, we're very puzzled that the sainted JFK would say this. And so this sort of the cognitive dissonance is intended to distance these people and the horrendous actions that they got involved in. Look, Roosevelt tries to pack the court. He wants to add unilaterally 6 new members to the Supreme Court to completely ruin the independence of the judiciary. And so the historians kind of wittily have described this as the switch in time that saved 9, as if this little funny proverb disguises the fact that the Supreme Court essentially declared its non-independence, essentially put itself into subservience to FDR to avoid the court-packing scheme. An absolute fascist move by FDR, but covered up by progressive historians as though it was a little funny little move by FDR that happily brought the court into harmony with FDR's marvelous programs.
Well, it's a funny thing, too, because that's becoming so lost in time, Dinesh, that I don't think people remember that there was a time in America where your right to property was considered as sacred as your right to free speech or your right to own a weapon and so on. And I really think, as you make this very strong case, it was in the 1930s that really fell apart.
I think it's interesting that we keep hearing now how the two parties supposedly switched places, that the Republican Party in a sense, became the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party became the Republican Party. And this is complete nonsense. And what I mean by that is that the core idea of the Republican Party now is identical with what it was in 1860. Let me put it this way. In defining slavery, Abraham Lincoln said that the essence of slavery was represented in the phrase, "You work, I eat." For him, the essence of slavery is stealing another man's labor. You make him work for you, in a sense, for free. You take the fruit of his labor. So Lincoln defined the Democratic Party as the party that steals other people's labor. And he defined the Republican Party as the party where you get to keep your own stuff, the fruit of your earnings. As Lincoln puts it, the hand that makes the corn gets the right to put the corn into its own mouth. Now, I ask you, is not the platform of the Republican Party today essentially the hand that makes the corn should put the corn into its own mouth? And is not the platform of the Democratic Party today, you work, I eat?
Number of slave owners who were Republicans by the time of the Civil War. What was that number?
That number was, in fact, 0.
All right, now let's just take a pause. I want that goose egg to roll around in people's brains for a little bit. Number of Republicans who owned slaves, 0. Number of Democrats?
So on the eve of the Civil War, there were, in fact, 4 million slaves in America, and every one of those was owned by a Democrat. The reason I got into this, by the way, is, the left was saying to me, well, Dinesh, you're talking about history, the Republican Party, the anti-slavery party, the Democrat, but there was a lot of blame to go around, wasn't there? And I said, no, actually no. The slavery debate was straight out between the pro-slavery Democratic Party, by the way, in the North and the South, and the anti-slavery Republican Party. The reason this is significant is that after the war, the Democrats launched a massive campaign, which progressives have sort of continued to today, to shift the blame from the Democratic Party to the South. Because by shifting it to the South, by making it a regional culpability, now they get to go from city to city, pulling down Confederate monuments and so on. The South has to take the blame, but the blame more squarely belongs to the Democratic Party. Most Southerners did not own slaves. Most Confederates did not own slaves. Robert E. Lee is an ambiguous figure, a lot of good things about him, a few bad things about him. He was not half a bad guy as most of the Democratic presidents of the last 200 years.
Right. So to move forward, we're going to do a little bit of a time jump, though, so everyone grab onto your helmets. But looking at what happened in Charlottesville just a few days ago, a lot of people see this violence erupting out of nowhere. It seems like, where are all these people? Why are they so angry? Why are they pulling down statues? Why are they pelting people with bricks who are trying to exercise their right of free speech? Why are permits being dragged out? And why are these attacks happening? Why are there scream downs of speeches and pulling of firearms and so on? But there is a very robust, which is not to say logical, but a very robust intellectual framework that grows out of early Marxism and grows out of Marcuse and other people. I wonder if you can help people understand the mindset that is driving this resistance to free speech in America at the moment and around the West.
Well, this is a very important issue because there's no ideology on the right. There's no ideology on the Republican side that justifies violence of any kind. And moreover, there's no presence on the right of any kind of extremism of this sort. I've been speaking at GOP, Lincoln dinners, Reagan dinners since my first book was published in 1991. My wife asked me the other day, have you ever seen a Klansman or a skinhead or a neo-Nazi at any of these events? And I said, it was pretty ridiculous. It's never happened. These people are not a presence in the Republican Party. So when the left tries to portray the neo-Nazis and so on as mainstream Republicans, they're creating an alternative universe of pure fiction. So that's the first point to note. The other thing is that on the left, Herbert Marcuse, whom you mentioned, was a refugee from Nazism. He came to America, taught, I believe, at the University of California in San Diego. He became a guru of the New Left. And he began a very ingenious mode of argument, which he published in an essay called Repressive Tolerance. Think of the Orwellian significance, repressive tolerance. Basically, what Marcuse goes is he says, we on the left, we are the tolerant people. But, very big but, he goes, we don't have to be tolerant of the intolerant. So if we can classify our opponents as intolerant, then we don't have to respect their civil rights or their First Amendment rights. We get to shut them down, shout them out, run them over, beat them up, kill them if we have to, because repressing these people is a moral and social good. The phrase that became associated with Marcuse, I don't think he invented it, but it epitomizes his writing, no free speech for fascists. And so you can literally call Marcuse the philosophical guru of the Antifa movement on the left today.
Well, and they believe, I think very strenuously and sometimes violently, they believe, of course, that the disasters of Nazism arose from the public dissemination of particular ideas, and therefore it is a matter of elemental self-defense to prevent the spread of those ideas by any means necessary, because they are a toxicity that causes the deaths of millions and represses and concentration camps and Holocaust and so on. And I guess it's kind of seductive. If you're not very good at debating back, I guess you want to pick up a brick instead.
Well, this is why the charge of fascism that is made against Trump and the right is not a mere insult. Some people say, well, it's just rhetorical excess. These people don't understand what they're saying. But what it's the purpose served by this accusation is to justify a whole bunch of extreme and kind of unusual measures taken by the left that would otherwise be completely inexcusable. Trying to pressure electors to change their commitments, mainstream Democrats refusing to attend the inauguration, disrupting the inauguration and breaking up the festivities, sending mass thugs to campuses to drive rare conservatives who show up to chant, preventing them from speaking. Now, if we did this to Obama, the result would be absolute apoplexy. But it's considered to be warranted in the case of Trump. Why? Because the meta story is that, well, Trump is sort of like Hitler in 1933. And if we had to do some crazy stuff to get rid of that guy, think of all the carnage that would have been prevented later. So the fascism meme, if you will, is not innocent. It's serving the purpose of covering up a lot of excess extremism and sheer thuggery on the left.
Let's talk a little bit about Martin Heidegger, who's one of the, when I was studying this stuff in college, I read some Heidegger and so on. And then it came to somewhat of a shock to me somewhat later when I found out that he was significantly pro-Nazi. Now, that's not the kind of thing you think would just get swept under the rug. Yet because of his involvement in developing some of this philosophy, again, he seems to have been whitewashed from any of these associations. It really is quite astounding.
Yeah, now Heidegger is a genuinely profound and important thinker. Some people consider him the leading philosopher of the 20th century. I don't mean in what I'm about to say to diminish the importance of his philosophical work, but here's the important point. Heidegger has become a hero on the left. Why? Because he is an enemy of technological capitalism. He hated America. He was an apostle of a kind of deep environmentalism that saw the earth, in a sense, as having its own claims. He was an anti-humanist, if I can put it that way. And so the left loves Heidegger. And so when the revelations came out that not only was Heidegger a member of the Nazi Party, he tried to implement Nazi intolerance through the universities, but he was also a lifelong anti-Semite. He remained an anti-Semite long after World War II. The left has tried to cover up for Heidegger. What they've said is that, well, he might have been that way, but that does not contaminate his political ideology, and we should continue to be able to draw on it. This stuff is really important because we see how the anti-fascist party today, the left, itself has fascist roots. Another good example of this, besides Heidegger, George Soros. George Soros, who purports to be an anti-fascist, funds a bunch of these anti-fascist groups, calls his society, his philanthropic group, the Open Society Foundation. When Soros was a young man in Hungary, Hitler-controlled Hungary, he and a bunch of other guys were going through Jewish neighborhoods, confiscating Jewish property and turning it over to the Nazi-run regime. Soros was confronted about this by Steve Croft of CBS News a few years ago. And not only did he admit it, but he said he had no regrets. He didn't feel an ounce of guilt about it. And he goes, well, that stuff was happening anyway. So if I took advantage of it, it's no different than me taking advantage of market opportunities today. So this is the deep amoralism that drives people like Soros. Behind their anti-Nazism is, well, a streak of Nazism.
You also, I think, unpack something that I've noticed. I think everybody who debates in the world these issues has noticed, which is this really annoying tendency that the left has to psychologize people rather than address their arguments. You know, it's like, oh, well, you know, white people it's a white lash. They're just angry that they're losing power and they're lashing out. Or, you know, if you criticize feminism, it's because you can't get laid. Like, it's all just really goofy stuff and very much not an argument. But you sort of point out this Adorno's F scale, or this idea of how you can explain how somebody might become a tyrant. And it has zero political considerations whatsoever, but really delves into sort of deep, dark Freudian, unprovable base of the brain stuff. I want to even help people unpack how the left ended up with this magic wand of psychologizing to make arguments go away.
Well, Adorno was a leading member of the group called the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School, many of them refugees from Nazism, many of them Jewish, and many of them also Marxist. So two of the leading members of the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse, whom we've mentioned earlier, and Theodor Adorno, come to the United States. And they're trying to market their standard variety of Marxism, but nobody really is interested. It's the era after World War II. And then these two guys get a sort of a brainwave. They go, we've just come from Nazi Germany, so we can pass ourselves off as the world's experts on fascism. Whatever we say fascism is, most people are going to believe that's what it is, because there was a lot of confusion in America about the true ideological content of fascism and what would make, for example, Germany stick with Hitler for so long. What explained the roots of German attachment to this strange man? So Adorno basically decides that he's going to be the guru of anti-fascist education in the United States, and he develops an F scale, F standing for fascism. And you basically fill out a questionnaire, and it determines if you have fascistic tendencies. Now, the thing that makes it today, I think in retrospect, somewhat amusing, is Adorno could have solved that problem by asking a simple question. Do you support the strong, centralized state controlling the economy and people's lives? If you answer yes, you've got fascistic tendencies. If you answer no, you don't. But instead, Adorno ignores that question, the most important question, and he invents 10 irrelevant questions. He says things like, do you think, for example, that men should be able to tell women what to do? Do you think, for example, that children should show unquestioning obedience to their parents? He essentially converts fascism from what it really is, the ideology of the centralized state, to essentially an ideology of what Adorno considered to be sexual repression. So the bohemian becomes an
Stefan Molyneux on YouTube. Check him out. Watch the rest of that. It's titled Leftist Fascism. Dinesh D'Souza and Stefan Molyneux. And this kind of covered things I already covered, but in more depth. I've got books all over the place that cover these connections, but this is stuff that they don't teach in high school, they don't teach in history class, they don't teach in colleges. But why is that? Well, he brought up people like Soros. Soros would have been sent to a concentration camp, but he was willing to sell out his own people for his progress. And, that is a moral, thing, that type of construct of thinking. He believes that you should be allowed to do anything to protect yourself and gain power. That's authoritarian. And a lot of these people on the left, they have made their money off of lies. They have created these organizations based off of lies. Do you really think, Al Gore is trying to save the world when he uses as much electricity, jet fuel, gasoline, and whatever else he does that we don't know about? Him alone, stopping doing anything, should be able to help if, we're talking about carbon emissions. Him and all of his buddies, and then we wouldn't have to worry about it. But we know it's based off of a lot of lies, that he will get rich off of carbon credits. Why he pushes what he pushes. You look at the whole left spectrum, they all have organizations. You look at the right, and, and this is not saying that they don't have organizations of their own, but a lot of the organizations are very public organizations that are out there doing things, that you can find them at hospitals, that you can find them at events, where really very few of the leftist ones can you find out in public. You don't really see the Clinton Foundation out, doing things. And when they're caught, they're over in Haiti making, closed doors deals about nothing that ends up helping out the Haitians. George Soros, you just go on and on. This is how they're able to fund their propaganda. This is how they run so much of the media. This is how they've taken over the public education. This is how they've taken over the colleges. Where when you look at who donates more, well, when you look at foundations that aren't related to you, the right tends to donate more to churches, to all kinds of organizations, not necessarily ones they created. So if the Clintons are donating to the Clinton Foundation and their buddies donate, and you don't ever see them out in the street, but then the right's donating to a church that they're not a part of, and their friends donate to a church that they might not be a part of, to the food pantry, and you can go there and get food. There are big differences. That's not saying the right doesn't have their own, organizations that they're donating to that are a little shady. that doesn't mean that the left doesn't have some organizations that they're willing to donate to that aren't shady. But when we look at the bigger picture and where a lot of this funding ends up, you see where the right has lost all traction of trying to get their side out or the truth out. You know, I've always, you know, Dinesh D'Souza even talked about, you know, the smaller government, you know, libertarian is the real, you know, alt-right, like I said at the beginning, but the word alt-right, I said, do not connect yourself to that because that's not what you think it is. I've said this before Trump was elected. Do not put yourself in the alt-right because it's not what you think. It's not the libertarian movement. And libertarians got caught up in it. And some of them are having to stick with it. But it's not what it seems. If you look at the alt-right, if anything, they're the alternative right to the Democratic Party. The commies are the alternative left to the Democratic Party. The progressives are the centrists of the Democratic Party. The progressives are the centrists of the Republican Party. The constitutionalists would be the left of the Republican Party. The libertarians would be the right of the Republican Party. The progressives are losing power in both parties to one party. The authoritarian philosophy that has come out of the left for this long has now infiltrated both parties. Libertarians, we thought we were getting there. Constitutionalists, we thought, we were actually working together. Whether, the people behind the scenes with the alt-right and the alt-left are working together. Just look at, Unite the Right organizer was a Obama supporter, worked for Obama. Unite the Right? Really? Oh, I've changed my mind. I've come to the... So you went from the socialist, communist, Marxist to the National Socialist? No, you really haven't changed. So you can look at all these factors and you make up your own decision, but look at all the facts. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to go to ucy.tv. Scroll down on the bottom, click the Amazon button, click or shop Amazon through ucy.tv, and you get the same great price, the same great shipping rate, and UCY gets a little kickback to help cover operating costs. And don't forget, My Patriot Supply at antityrannynews.com/MyPatriot. Same deal, same shipping rate, and we get a little kickback to help cover our operating costs on our end. And again, thank you all for tuning in tonight, and stay tuned here on UCY. Great broadcast coming up after this. And, don't forget, if you're a libertarian, you love freedom, you're not alone. But the media is not going to put us on the spot because we might have legitimate arguments against both parties and the system.